Hello and welcome to How Could We, a podcast by EIT Climate-KIC, where we ask ourselves, how could we achieve a climate-resilient, inclusive and beautiful future for all? I'm your host, Anne-Sophie Garrigou. We created this space to allow for a series of conversations about building hope, curiosity and excitement for a just and desirable future that is compatible with our planetary boundaries. Here we talk to people who inspire us and who are putting transformative solutions into practice. In our previous series, we talked about many topics, including the need to redefine development funding, what it means to practice radical collaboration, and the power of art to reinvigorate the climate movement. Now, this new series is all about cities. In the previous episodes, we talked about community engagement, about collaboration between cities and between stakeholders within a city. And in today's episode, we are going to try to get some answers about what role industries have to play in the city's climate neutrality goals, and how is the dialogue between cities and industries going so far. What are the challenges, the opportunities, and how it relates to the delivery of the European Green Deal. I'm excited to welcome our guest, Diane Holdorf of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, a CEO-led organization of more than 200 companies that was born out of the Earth Summit in Rio, de Janeiro in 1992, and that works to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals that you might know as the SDGs. They focus on many different things, from the circular economy to the transformation of cities and mobility, climate, energy, food and land and water. We decided to bring back EIT Climate-KIC CEO Dr. Kirsten Dunlop in this episode to have a conversation with Diane Holdorf. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. Diane, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your background and how did you get there?
Hi, Anne-Sophie. It's great to be here today. Happy to share and to be part of this. So I'm Diane Holdorf. I started my career in consulting. I spent almost 20 years as a consultant working across a really wide range of sectors and industries, always with a focus on environment, really moving into sustainability back before that was recognized as the key topic area that is driving so much of business strategy and the work that we do together today. From consulting, I moved into the private sector. I spent just over a decade as a chief sustainability officer for a global food company. And that helped take the skills of consulting into a complete company and value chain implementation strategy. What do we need to do to be able to implement, take it in this case all the way to the field, but then also out into product and brand marketing? How do we talk about this in a way that matters to both farmers and consumers for that sector? That brought me into the sphere of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD. And about 5.5 years ago, I joined WBCSD to bring both sets of skills into this space of collective action. How do companies think about the types of tools, mechanisms, frameworks, actions, advocacy, and now even to the point of co-investment that connect value chains that companies need to implement in their own operations in a way that's consistent and credible, all the way through from engaging suppliers through to transparent disclosure and reporting. So that's just a little bit about the journey that I've been on to get to this space, and it's a very exciting arena to be working in.
And what are the key challenges that industries are facing or will face in the future to support cities in achieving their climate neutrality goals?
One of the things that I find so fascinating about what businesses are doing and what cities are doing is that cities represent a very specific geographic space. Businesses operate supply chains and value chains that cross those geographic spaces. And so just like cities can't decarbonize without access to the products and the materials and the skills that businesses have that they bring into cities, either through procurement or implementation, cities can't succeed in their decarbonization and transition strategies without the support of the types of infrastructure and employee bases that cities provide. So there's a very much a dependency and interconnectivity, but we've not really unpacked what that means in a way that crosses city boundaries and supports the types of investment that is needed for businesses to also succeed in their climate strategies.
So how exactly do we overcome those challenges?
When cities recognize what their needs are in a way that goes beyond their own geographic border, and that businesses, the private sector, join the cities in those conversations to identify what are the best solutions needed and what kind of co-investment will it take to deliver. Specific examples. We can't really get to implementing electric freight or electric busing transit at scale without the types of e-charging infrastructure that needs a energy infrastructure enabler and a built environment infrastructure enabler until we know what are the most important logistics corridors, mostly sea to land, but also cross land. What are the energy types that are needed? What's the infrastructure that will support that, from grid through to actual location-based charging infrastructure at the size that's going to support that type of heavy freight or heavy busing long route transit? That only then really happens once you bring cities and business together.
I really like this example because the mobility is something that everyone understands and everyone uses. And we can find example in the food sector, in like a lot of other sector as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. Logistics is not sector specific. There are aspects to it, for example, refrigeration, like in your food example. However, the general concept of these connected logistics corridors is really, really critical. And when it comes to the significant types of investments, be it hydrogen investments in port cities that will secure supply across multiple city connection points, or the types of transit routes that big trade needs for moving heavy equipment and materials for construction and renovation purposes. These are the types of things that start to get very specific that we can plan for better when we do it together.
Can you tell me a little bit how the WBCSD work with cities today, a bit more?
Yeah, so it's a platform that brings today over 245 companies together who are very committed to integrating sustainability, adaptation, mitigation, nature positive, climate positive, people positive outcomes into how they're operating, because they recognize it as key to their performance. What that means is that they're really planning for how they implement sustainability across their business strategies, both to serve customers like cities, but also to successfully, for example, decarbonize in the operations that they have in cities or in the logistics and sourcing routes that they use through and with cities. So the intersections come in a variety of different ways, because that demand signal to business from cities can be quite clear, and our companies think about that when they think about their priorities. But it can also then come in, how do we, as companies are thinking about what are the green corridors that they need to invest in, how can they partner with cities to take that further?
So more and more cities in Europe are committing to reaching climate neutrality. We have 112 of them in Europe and in associated countries. They even want to achieve that goal by 2030, which is 20 years ahead of what the EU Green Deal planned. So we've talked about the Net Zero Cities program in our previous episode with Thomas Osdoba, if listeners are interested, but cities won't be able to achieve these goals if industries aren't ready. So Kirsten, Diane, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what's at stake here when it comes to all the things that are needed. Kirsten, do you want to get us started?
So I think one of the most challenging aspects, and also one of the areas of most significant opportunity for any part of the world that is taking on something as ambitious as the European City Mission, is that cities constitute really market makers in a real sense. They have an aggregate demand for materials, for resources, for infrastructure, for logistics, and actually for new business models that would enable urban remanufacturing, circularity, kind of very new, different, much more inherently sustainable ways of living. If they can aggregate their needs, they represent an enormous opportunity for businesses, large and small, trying to transition or speed up their transition into sustainable business models, markets, material models, productivity, and particularly speed up where they can put into practice a separation of growth and kind of economic development prosperity from raw materials and kind of sources of production, extractive consumption. The challenge, of course, is that cities are inherently spatial. For urban transformation to be effective, it needs to be integrated and systemic. So many elements need to come together effectively in order to enable a transition that is smooth, that is just, and that is as efficient financially and materially as possible. And that's not easy, because that I perceive as being a tension on two fronts. One, the degree of integrated, deliberate, systematic planning of what is needed, when, in what sequence, by when, with what interdependencies, and deliberate, integrated, systematic planning also of thinking through the limits to materials or metals or available raw materials, the limits to business models that may not actually be able to address the scale needed, and therefore different choices or different model choices around, say, energy, alternative energy, renewable energy sources, versus urban planning choices around the way in which transport and mobility are arranged, or the way in which logistics are thought through. So it requires a very holistic, integrated, planned approach. And that does sit in tension with the way in which, as a world, in the global north, we have encouraged economic development and business to think in competitive terms of individual businesses seeking to maximize outcomes for individual returns, rather than necessarily a systematic whole of supply chain, whole of industry, agreed planning and almost managed commodity trading. So it opens up a whole new set of opportunities and possibilities, but also challenges on how also to rethink the model by which we implement the many hundreds of solutions that businesses have and are actively seeking to develop, but implement them in place in contexts that are specific and require specific solutions that are also culturally meaningful or effective in particular physical contexts of heat, of water, or of changing weather. To do so in an integrated and planned way without incurring issues of perception of anti-competitive behavior, and to do so in such a way that each individual business can thrive, but that the city as a whole and as a shared environment of public and private wealth creation, value creation, and shared revenue can thrive. And that's uncharted waters. So it's super exciting, but it does require a very considerable effort and the kind of collaborative partnerships that we are reaching out for.
Kirsten, you laid it out in a way that sets the economic opportunity, the employment opportunity, and the access to needed resources challenge. And that to me is this perfect intersection of supporting cities in the necessary transition and leveraging the private sector in a very different way to help cities, and then in turn, of course, the companies and businesses, large and small, also achieve the needed decarbonization solutions that they have and have to implement. So, for example, as I build a bit on what you said, there is a real global race for enough of the materials needed to help the world, much less these Climate-KIC cities of Europe, achieve their decarbonization targets. In order for cities to have access to the scale of the materials that are going to be needed for them all to take action by 2030 and then on to 2050, there has to be a more coherent way of sending that demand signal so that businesses can prepare and respond to that with sufficiency of supply. And that's one of the areas where we see there's a big opportunity for innovation. If I take us back to COVID, in COVID, we saw a real breakdown of global supply chains because things had to shut down. And it took years for the supply chain to actually recover for sufficient building materials, just all kinds of things. We witnessed it in our daily lives, and businesses witnessed it on a very significant scale. If we draw that correlation into how do we unlock a more coherent demand signal so that all of the materials needed can flow in a more consistent fashion, in a better time managed and supply managed fashion, we'll be able to support cities from a private sector standpoint in a way that isn't initially being planned for. So there are real important connections to be built here so that those demand signals can be responded to, because some of these things take even though the solutions are ready and identified and known, and the materials are identified and ready and known, it can still take 1, 2, 3 years to put the demand into the provisioning of supply. And we've got to be able to do that at a much greater scale that then allows us to actually pick up the pace.
I wanted us to talk a little bit more about how can cities and industries collaborate more effectively to accelerate this transition toward climate neutrality, because we might have like cities leaders, business leaders listening to the podcast, and the idea is to give them ideas of how they can better work together, what is already happening, what you've seen work, not work also. Maybe Diane, do you want to get us started?
Certainly. I'll take the business lens. Kirsten, I know you'll come back in with more of the city's lens. One of the things that we've talked about with our members, and this is true for large and for SME companies, is how to better anticipate the needs of cities with the work that's coming up, be it renovation, be it building, be it infrastructure investment, be it logistics and upgrades. Being able to connect earlier and understand what's coming allows businesses to respond faster. But this requires also a couple of different things. And we've got to think about how will cities be sourcing the materials needed for the plans that they're putting in place? Do they have a way, building from their climate plans, to look at a much larger scale of purchase signaling or timing signaling? And what I think gets really interesting is if we have cities who are connected on big logistics corridors, be it for industry or for goods movement, how might those cities then come together in ways that they probably haven't done before to think about what's going to be needed for them to achieve these in a more synchronized way? And then send that aligned signal to the marketplace. That allows companies of every size, the provisioning of labor, the provisioning of materials, the provisioning of design support, the provisioning of project management, to come into this in a way that is pretty unprecedented, but allows for a way faster integrated, implemented solution to come to play. That's what we think would be incredibly exciting.
One of the challenges, as I understand it, from the city's perspective, is the scale of what's needed and the fragmentation. And this is a two-way challenge, the fragmentation of who to talk to address that scale and to address the multiple parts of the problem in a way that is indeed integrated or that comes together in a sort of much, much more holistic and systematic way. In the city, you've got a lot of different pieces of a puzzle, not necessarily governed under the same city government departments or not necessarily funded in ways that are completely synchronized. And I think for cities, one of the challenges also, there are many actors in the business environment who and how to engage in an extremely joined up way. So, for example, in France, one of the big changes coming through as a result of the European Green Deal and the city's mission is the requirement to do spatial energy planning for cities and districts and regions. And that requires a much, much more joined up conversation amongst all actors involved with a set of choices to be made on, for example, do cities and regions in France really step up on the possibility of using thermal energy and geothermal energy, so energy coming from the Earth's core through pipes that are drilled down into the core. Relatively easy to do, not especially expensive, but is a completely different energy model to the models that we have had for oil and coal, oil, gas-powered power stations with big centralized energy stations and distribution. These are distributed, decentralized models. And for that kind of model to be put into place en masse, then there needs to be a related systematic planning of all of the other business services from installation, maintenance. Diane rightly mentioned employment, jobs. Of course, skills becomes absolutely critical and challenging. But most all, it requires a coherent, coordinated set of conversations, which I think represents, again, a huge opportunity, but also a very material challenge. On the city side, the real challenge sits in capacity. Cities are often poorly or kind of stretched very thin in terms of the capacity, human capacity, budgetary capacity, planning capacity to be able to bring all of the actors together and hold them together in a systematic way to try and work this through. So the word unprecedented is absolutely right. The city's mission in Europe is creating opportunities and methods by which cities, for example, along corridors or in areas in common ground, common geophysical areas, can come together and form cohorts and think together like this.
Let me build quickly on this point, Kirsten, that you made about the role of spatial planning and the fact that France is leading in the use of spatial planning. The tools for spatial planning aren't necessarily new, but the ways in which they're being applied are expanding really, really quickly. And this is an area where the private sector is using spatial planning for physical risk planning and mitigation. Cities should be using it far more for the same. And the tech that's developed in the private sector for this is something that could be accessed and used equally by cities. So these technology solutions and the sharing of tech solutions, the role of AI in planning, the partnerships that are required for what is the 30-year plan that a city has for its needs, from technology to energy to water to heating and cooling to logistics. These are things where there's a lot of information and knowledge in the private sector that could be applied really quickly in support of the city solutions and the connected solutions between and across cities and regions in far better and faster ways. And the skills that are needed then to interpret, design, procure, and deliver those solutions are really quite different than what we've trained for decades. And again, this is an area where the private sector needs investment in skills as much as the public sector does. So we should be planning for a much better joined up skills and capacity building transition as we are for materials and the technical solutions that will deliver. The piece that we need to rethink, I keep coming back to the need for businesses and cities to really initially prioritize what are the longer term infrastructure transition needs that are going to serve both what cities require and what the businesses in their geography and across and connecting into their geographies are going to need. I know we've touched on it a few times. Energy, water. Water is going to be key, and we don't often talk about it enough. The technologies are going to be able to provide heating and cooling. The climate is changing more rapidly in Europe than we see in even other parts of the world, with temperatures rising in particular. How about adaptation to increasing storms, floods, the damage to infrastructure that happens as a result of that? These are the things that I think we can prioritize in bringing cities and businesses together to help to solve for.
Do you have examples of collaborations between members of the WBCSD and cities that have made significant progress towards sustainability and climate goals?
We've been part of a multi-government investment partnership called the Zero Emission Vehicle Emerging Markets Initiative. And the first country that really stepped up and leaned into that was India. India, which is a very federal-based system with very strong provinces, obviously not the same as the EU, but similar in the way that it needs to really bring together multiple strong federal, provincial governments together for planning. And India brought together a total plan for e-freight, electric freight across the country, on what was going to be needed for investing in the infrastructure for charging, in the trucks, the electric trucks that were going to be needed to send that demand signal, because they knew they were going to need tens of thousands, not just a few hundred across the country. And to do all of that, the government had some investment capacity, but they really needed multilateral investment commitment and, equally importantly, business investment commitment to build, supply, and implement a complete overhaul to their e-freight logistics. And they needed that to achieve, this is going to deliver almost a 20% reduction on their emissions, because of the role that freight plays in ground logistics across India. So together, we led the private sector commitment into the provisioning of what will be an equivalent of over 9,000 e-trucks with the associated e-charging infrastructure by 2030. It needs to grow beyond that, but as a starting point, it's pretty impressive. But it took a very different type of thinking to achieve that. So we've started to think about what would that mean if we brought that then into the European context. That was, this big corridor investment where cities are connecting and companies are connecting on the solutions that are needed. Those give us a real insight to what we can learn and apply.
And I think maybe I could add a sort of another end of the scale, a much smaller solution, one that similarly opens up a set of precedents and questions for how to scale, because this is about speed and scale. And ultimately, in the marriage between cities and industry, we have an opportunity to do speed and scale somewhere closer to where it needs to be, as really the only currency that matters now. And the example I have in mind is Rzeszów in Poland, where you have a relatively small city that has really systematically supported the development of solar manufacturing capacity. So targeting PV, solar PV, to serve the European market more broadly. But what it means is that the city has signaled and worked with the Polish government. So they've worked on multi-level governance from the city, the region, up to the Polish government to work on asking for procuring, permissioning targeted categories. So targeted project categories like, for example, building material that has solar PV integrated into it, like roof tiles and wall materials. So you can use every single surface possible, which obviously in a context like Poland matters because you really need to maximize what you can do with the sun. Smart transit, so transit stops for public transport or for private vehicles, which again have fully integrated PV public interfaces. So they're trying to use every single available piece of surface that the city can offer, not as a privately owned infrastructure, but as publicly available infrastructure that then enables public-private partnerships. And in that sense, they're really trying to anticipate and pull through a set of shifts in the market that can then demonstrate in much larger markets that are adjacent, like Germany, how you could do this kind of integrated product development, service development, public-private value creation, public-private service generation. And if you think about then any platform that helps aggregate up numerous examples of that, where cities can learn from each other, but more importantly, they can put industry around the table and say, so this means we're going to need the business models ready, we're going to need supply. Of course, this does open up huge questions, as Diane mentioned, on provisioning and regulating or distributing the access to provisioning, who gets to procure what, in a shared, in a managed way, or in a simply Wild West, first come, first serve. So trying to create these integrated systems of very deliberate planned opportunity, planned development, and partnership. I think probably the number one experience that we would have so far, and if I think of the examples, say in Stockholm or in Helsinki, in Finland, for example, where you have really long-standing partnerships between Business Finland and Finnish cities. Partnership, the way in which partnership evolves into much more multi-sided, long-term planned, shared visioning and understanding of what is needed and how to get there. That kind of partnership then also creates the elements for a much more agile, responsive reaction when you do then have climate adaptation or climate risks, climate events taking place that suddenly requires a scrambling of repair and mobilization of both human resources to repair, but also business responses in stepping in to change what is there.
What makes you optimistic today already about the collaboration happening? Like the example that you gave, for instance, and the collaboration, the things that you're seeing already, Kirsten with Climate-KIC, Diane with the WBCSD, on achieving the European Green Deal.
What makes me optimistic is that most of the solutions that we need exist today. What we haven't figured out yet how to do is, Kirsten, as you were saying, activate them at much greater scale and at much greater speed. This is going to take alignment on how we prioritize which solutions are best in which markets for which outcomes. It's going to take realignment often of permitting and certification and approval schemes for implementation, because these technologies are new, which means they may not match exactly how prior solutions have made their way through approval and zoning processes. And it requires an investment in the skills training and jobs agenda that is in front of us. Each of those things, though, creates opportunity. And because it creates opportunity and maintains economic growth patterns and gives insight to the skills and jobs opportunities that exist, I have real hope that we can get there. That what we're talking about here, joining up the discussion across sectors and multiplying beyond single city conversations or single company conversations, is what I think will actually then help to drive the acceleration. And we know how to convene those types of conversations. We just have to do it in a way that designs for the types of outcomes at greater scale that we need. So that's why I have hope.
Indeed, I would add, I have quite a long list of things that give me hope in this regard. One of them starts with the fact that the will to partner and the will to collaborate and the will to bring that kind of joined up discussion together and to the table is really, really felt, very strong, very felt, and moving even more positively in a supportive direction. So the partnership that I am very proud to say Climate-KIC has struck with WBSSD and all of the kind of local business chambers that are part of the WBSSD network in working on the city mission in a European context and looking at how can we join forces. And it's a partnership very much built on the strength of visioning and of commitment to the fact that this is a context in which extraordinary opportunity for all emerges. So it's worth investing in. For both organizations, just put effort in behind to try and make something happen and to create the conditions for that, because it's so aligned with our objectives on achieving the kind of impact on climate change and positive impact on building sustainable societies. If I can build out from that, in a European context and in a global context where I look at what is Europe trying to do, there is something unusual about the way in which this particular initiative creates a very clear directional signal. And I know from my prior work within corporate context, some form of steady signal is worth its weight in gold. If you can get a steady signal, a sense of timeframes, a sense of things moving in a direction somehow inexorably, it's so much easier to plan for accelerated, anticipated agility, movement, change, and bold, bigger, riskier decisions than would have been possible in the past. So the cities acting together, signing up and committing, the hundreds of thousands of cities that signed up to participate in this initiative, and the many that are still waiting on the wings, keen to participate, that's an extremely positive signal, because it does create the kind of mutually reinforcing environment where finding a way to put these pieces together is going to be possible. I think the other thing is cities are the physical, emotional places where we can see climate change affecting people en masse. You can see climate change affecting the world, natural world, everywhere, but cities are where you really see it affecting people. And they are also the contexts in which you can see positive change. You can go from one city to another where really significant differences have been brought about in quiet, sustainable, energy-efficient transport, in green environments that are vibrant and living, the air is clean, the streets are peaceful, the ways in which people are reacting with each other, engaging with each other are very different. You can see very materially the difference that is made. And that kind of visible, tangible evidence of the fruits of partnership that has come about because businesses have collaborated and found solutions to bring them together, to integrate them, to put them into place at scale. That gives a positive sense of possibility. And the more we can scale up and speed up those kinds of demonstrations, the more that you can do it in the bigger, longer plays where people beginning to commute or traveling across the surface of Europe, across member states, start to see patterns in that demonstration of possibility and start to conceive and imagine on bigger scales of what change could look like on a continental scale. That is where hope comes from. They create stories of people coming back and saying, we had a conference recently in Ghent. Ghent is beautiful. It's the most stunning environment to walk around in. And you can hear people's conversations commenting on that, noticing the differences, noticing what's being brought together. I think that's where there's a very real possibility to give ourselves glimpses of a future in which people can live in just, resilient, peaceable, and very sustainable ways.
Thank you, Kirsten. And I really like that we end up this episode after talking about business in cities, quite theoretical and talking about people. So thank you for bringing us back to that. Diane, I'm asking every guest on this podcast, what would a beautiful, climate resilient and just future look like for you?
I think Kirsten just outlined it beautifully. The ability for people to live in equitable, peaceful locations, cities, where they are contributing and receiving the benefits of the long-term plans that can really deliver the sustainable futures that we're all depending upon.
Thank you so much, Diane. Thank you so much, Kirsten. It was such a pleasure to have the conversation with you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. Thank you, Anne-Sophie.
Thank you all for listening. We'll leave some resources in the show notes for those of you who want to learn more about this important dialogue between cities and industries. This was the last episode of this season on cities transformation. We hope you liked it. Feel free to leave us a comment, share the episode with colleagues, and contact us if you have any questions. We'll come back with more episodes soon. In the meantime, you can follow the podcast wherever you listen to it, listen to all our previous seasons, and follow Climate-KIC on social media to learn more about what we do. This podcast was produced by Barbara Mendes-George. You will hear from us again soon. Bye!